Greetings, YouTube. I hope you'll pardon the fans. It is 6:03 a.m. and it's 84 degrees in my office. It's going to be 100 today. I'm not a fan of corruption. In the real world, I'm not a fan of corruption because, it kills people. But in role-playing games, I'm also not a big fan of corruption as a mechanic. As a narrative, I can completely get behind the concept of corruption because it exists in the real world. And of course, in a high fantasy setting, or even a high fantasy, a science fantasy setting like Star Wars, corruption does have a vibe. Like the dark side, corruption is the same thing. You're being lured into using the often it's viewed as the expedient method of achieving your ends. It's much more difficult to convince someone to be a good human being than to just cut their head off. Now they're no longer a problem, but you've made a massive, immoral act by cutting their head off because they were inconvenient. So when I encounter corruption in games, it bothers me. I am currently looking at a Pathfinder setting. I think it's called Amethyst Renaissance, and it's doing a more realistic, kind of a darker take on Shadowrun. So magic returns in like this century, and then it's jumping forward 500 years to the way the world looks in the future. And part of the mechanics in this is that when the magic returns, the corruption literally returns to the world. So you can essentially acquire corruptive taint on you, and over time you will be changed by that accumulation of corruption. But that is based on your decisions. So even though I don't like the mechanic, it's being based on your decisions. You decide to use things that are expedient, that involve corruption. You've decided to do that. And if you slowly begin to move in the direction of the corrupted until you are, lost to it, that's horrible. I'm sad for you. But it was of your own volition, taking into account all of the intersectional feminist concepts that can put a person into a position where they have to make expedient decisions that someone else who has more power and privilege doesn't have to make. I get that, okay? I'm not absolving anybody of that particular complexity. That's just the way the world works. Lots of people would like to have it otherwise. Tough. No. What bothers me is that within the setting, it's heavily Fae influence. There's a number, like 5 or 6 different species of Fae you can play. And they have, within the Fae group, they have analogs for like gnomes, analogs for dwarves, and analogs for orcs. Now, orcs, which are, I can't remember what they're called, but they're analogs for orcs, all right? They look like orcs. They behave like orcs. They're orcs. And they're the only species that has a life expectancy, I believe, shorter than humanity. There is a non-Fae species known as the Kodiaks, which are humanoid bears. I think they have the same life expectancy as humans. But the orcs have a much shorter life expectancy. They mature at age 9, and then they die at 40. So that's a short run, and that doesn't give you a lot of time to enjoy your childhood. Let's face it. That in itself could be problematic if you looked at it from again, intersectionally feminist complexity, because someone's being shoved into adulthood very rapidly, and that's going to have an effect on their ability to perceive the world through the same lens that someone who has a longer time to mature would experience. No, they're born with corruption out of the gate, out of the womb, into the world, and they are already corrupt. They possess sin at birth. It's the old original sin trope. Now, for those that might get up in arms because I am taking a shot at original sin, I am not Christian. I was raised Catholic, and I made a very conscious decision not to be Christian. Yes, I understand the faith. I have a good grasp of Judaism and Islam as well. The desert traditions, I got a pretty good firm grasp on them, and I despise the concept of sin. The only sin that I can say that I believe in is willful ignorance. That's it. And I think every other bad thing in the world is tied to willful ignorance. So yes, it's the original sin in that regard, I guess. But the idea that when you enter the world, God already hates you. He has already burdened you with sin for the temerity to be alive. I saw a phrase recently, and I felt it in my soul the first time I said it, is that I exist without my consent. And if I believed in original sin, that would be even stronger. And if I were an orc born into the world already corrupted, I think I'd spend my brief amount of adulthood from age 9 to 40 burning that shit down. I would probably do everything I could to just undermine everything that is in existence and bring it crashing down until the system is broken enough that it has to be rebuilt from the ground up, and people aren't born into the world with sin. So yes, to say that I have a very serious problem with that would be an understatement. Now I understand that there are games specifically built around the desert traditions, the whole Judeo-Christian worldview. I realize that Judeo-Christian is a problematic term. I apologize. The whole concept that, that Christian heaven and Christian hell are real places, even though those are different than the Jewish versions of that, which was the basis for the Christian. Yeah, again, complexities. And I never liked those games. It bugs the crap out of me that the Keanu Reeves film Constantine, which is a hoot, a lot of fun, great commentary track, highly rated, okay? A lot of fun to watch. And it says essentially that everyone has to live by our rules. There are no other faiths. There are no other versions of heaven, hell, or redemption or anything. That you don't follow a specific set of rules, you're going to be suffering for eternity. And the only justification for putting someone to eternal suffering is eternal harm. Did they commit an act of eternal evil? An act of evil that exists now and will continue to be actively engaged in the universe for eternity? And of course, that's not possible. So if the answer to that question is no, of course they can't do that, then they should not be suffering for eternity. Yes, this has turned into a bit of philosophy for you on your Saturday. But yes, I have a real problem with a species that's born into the world with sin, with corruption. I don't much like the corruption mechanic, and I really don't like when you tell people at birth that they are bad. Yeah, I have a real problem with that. It's the kind of thing that has real world ramifications, like telling someone they're bad because of their sexual orientation, or they're bad because of their gender performance or gender identity, saying they shouldn't be in public or they should be excluded from certain rights and privileges that all the people who aren't bad get to enjoy. Yeah. So let's talk about corruption and whether you think it is a viable mechanic for a game, and how you feel about folks being born into the universe corrupted.